I would like to introduce our next speaker, Boehm, from UNC Chapel Hill, and she's giving us a presentation on the evolution of
Sagacaran
in the diaspora. I'll leave it there.
The thing that's wrong with the screen is either red or blue isn't connecting to it. It's only got green connected.
Either way, green's not very important for me.
Just tweak the connecting cord.
I mean, it doesn't really have an effect on my presentation, but... Okay, good job. Yay! Sorry, I'm late. It didn't have to be green.
Techno wizards.
Alright, so I'm going to be talking to you about a language called Sagacaran, which is the language of a new refugee community here in the United States. The community has been growing significantly over the past decade, which I'll go into a little bit later. But there's not much known about their language called Sagacaran, and I'm hoping to help fix that. So brief overview, I'm going to go into a little bit of background on the Karen people, what we know about Sagacaran. I'm going to give you a brief overview of what we do know about the phonetics of Sagacaran based on a few studies that have been done. And then I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to go into how the phonetics are changing in this new diaspora community among Sagacaran millennials, so people in my generation who have grown up in drastically different situations from their parents. I'm also going to take a very preliminary look at the language vitality of Sagacaran in North Carolina, just to get a sense of how it's doing here in the diaspora. And also some very preliminary conclusions and what my next steps are for this research project. So who are the Karen? They are an ethnic minority group from Burma, which is a country that's formally known as Myanmar. I'm going to refer to it as Burma because that's what the Karen people call their country themselves. So out of respect for them, I call it Burma. But due to really, really severe civil unrest, and that is an understatement in Burma, among the various ethnic groups there, many Karen people have been forced into the diaspora over the past several decades. They have been persecuted by the Burmese militia who are in power in Burma. So the Karen state here is in yellow. That's where the majority of Karen people reside within Burma. And to the east is Thailand. And there are 9 main refugee camps along the Thai border where many Karen people have fled. And from there, many have gone abroad. Many of them settling right here in the southeast United States. We actually have a pretty sizable population of Karen people here, right close to Athens. So I'm going to be focusing today on the population in Orange County, North Carolina, where I'm from, Chapel Hill. And in 2013, there was an estimate of over 1,000 refugees from Burma currently living in Orange County alone. And most of those refugees are said to be Karen ethnic groups. There's also a few others. There's some Chin, it's another ethnic group, but Karen make up the vast majority. Okay. So Sagacaran is the language spoken by the Karen people. It's sort of the lingua franca of the Karen. There are a few other Karen languages, so Karen being one, but Sagacaran tends to be the one that most of the Karen people do speak. So if you speak Karen, chances are you also speak Sagacaran, versus not everyone who speaks Sagacaran speaks these other Karen languages, so it's kind of used as the lingua franca. And it's spoken by about 1.5 million people worldwide, according to an estimate from Ethnologue. But again, most of those, a really large portion of those speakers have been forced abroad into the diaspora. They're no longer in the Karen state in Burma. So what I want my study to look at is, how's it doing now that it's left sort of its homeland. And in the US, it's the 3rd most widely spoken language among refugees, preceded only by Arabic and Nepali. Mainly because in the mid-2000s, President George W. Bush made refugees from Burma a priority refugee group. So if you look at the census data starting around 2007, you get a really large influx refugees from Burma. So it's spoken by a really growingly large community here in the US. Despite all these facts, it is severely understudied. This is something that at UNC we put together the current research group to help counteract. There's not much known about the language at all. There's a handful of studies that have ever been done on the phonetics and phonology of the language, and those studies have their limits. So most of them are a little bit old. Jones, for example, did his in the 60s. They focus on elicitation from only 1 or 2 speakers. They're impressionistic, so they don't actually look at acoustic data, except for one study that I'll point to, done by a former colleague of ours, actually at UNC, did the first acoustic analysis of the phonetics. But all of those focused on only 1 speaker. So this talk today is part of a much larger project of mine. What I've done is I've recorded several different speakers of Ska Karen from different parts of Burma, across different generations, to see what are the different dialects of Ska Karen, what are their phonetic properties, how those properties changed over time in this new situation that these Karen people have found themselves in. And it's that generational divide that I'm going to focus on today. So brief recap of what we know and what my study has sort of confirmed. I'm not really going to go into a lot of it. This is the phonetic inventory of the consonants found in Ska Karen. It's got a couple of really cool sounds like an aspirated S, which is pretty rare. Among my analysis, all of the speakers that I've recorded have confirmed this inventory. There is some dialectal variation in terms of preferring certain consonants for certain lexical items, but all of the speakers do have this inventory for their language. Same story with the vowels. I've been told anecdotally that there's some dialect difference between vowels for certain lexical items. I haven't observed it myself, but this 9-vowel inventory is pretty consistent across both the previous literature and what I've found. And what I want to focus on today is the tone. So this is data from a study done by a former colleague, Fischer, in 2013. She worked with a Ska Karen speaker, actually one that participated in my study too. She'll go by F1. And she sat down with her for hours and hours and hours and did a full phonetic analysis of her language. And she found 6 tones, which was confirmed what some of the previous literature has said. 6 tones. You'll notice that 2 of them look very similar to each other. So tone 2 and tone 5 both have the same shape of contour. They're both high falling, and they both have what we call creaky voice. So in Ska Karen, it's not just the tone contour and level that is important, but all of the previous literature had argued you need to have certain voice quality associated with these tones. So there are 3 tones that are traditionally described as what we call checked, meaning they're produced with creaky voice. So tone 2, tone 5, and also tone 4 are all consistently in the literature described as having this creaky voice. And I'm going to show the millennials aren't having it. They're doing something different. So they're changing up the tone a little bit. So my main research questions, I want to see, for this talk, what phonetic changes has this upheaval, this political and social unrest, had on Ska Karen as a language. So the people in my generation who have grown up in the Thai refugee camps in this environment of intense dialect contact between the different Ska Karen dialects, what mark has that left on the phonetics of the language? And also, how is Ska Karen doing in terms of vitality? So now that it's in the diaspora, you have large communities across the US, you have communities in the UK and Australia. I want to focus on North Carolina specifically, but how is it doing? Are people still learning it? Still acquiring it? Preliminary answers based on preliminary analysis. The millennials, the main phonetic marker is that they are no longer producing creaky voice consistently for tones 2, 4, and 5, as was described in the literature and confirmed by some of the adults. And also, the new Karen Americans, the Karen children who are growing up in the US, who are born here, they are not acquiring Ska Karen as an L1 anymore. They're not fluent speakers. So It's not looking good right now, but we'll see if we can change that. Okay, so methods. I took 30 native speakers of Ska Karen aged 18 and older, and they were presented with a slideshow featuring one English word and one picture on each slide. And they were asked how to produce that word and that concept in Ska Karen. And I recorded them saying that word 2 times. If they didn't know the word, they didn't have to say it. Some words we did definitely have to skip. And these word lists were based on previous work. They were designed to elicit all of the minimal pairs for all of the phonemes that had been proposed for the language. Wanted to see if I sort of found the same thing. And the responses were recorded on this laptop. So here is an example of what they saw. So they would see this slide, I would sit down with them, they would have their headsets on. And I'd say, how do you say pig in Ska Karen? And they would say, ta, ta, which is actually how you say it, twice, and then move on to the next word. For 220 different lexical items. So it took a little bit, but they were good sports. And then after all the lexical items were elicited, I also gathered a little bit of extra linguistic data from them. I wanted to know their age. I wanted to know where they were from. That tended to be actually a little bit more tricky to identify, especially for the younger speakers who didn't remember their home village, but they at least were able to give me a region within the Karen state. Where else they had lived, what ages they had lived there, what other languages they speak, what language the parents speak. So basically anything I could think of that might affect their language, I collected data on. The results I'm going to discuss today are from 6 different speakers out of that 30. I'm still analyzing. So F1 is actually the same speaker that Fischer 2013 had focused on for her study. She is an older speaker. She's 53 at the time of recording. She's probably 54 now. She was from a town in the very south tip of that Karen state. And she lived in the Mela refugee camp for a long time before she came to the US in 2007. F2, F3, F4, and M1, those are all millennials. They are my generation. So as you can see, they moved to the camp when they were very, very young, or they were born there. You know, many people in our generation were born there. And also F5 is another older speaker. She grew up actually in Rangoon, the capital of Burma. So she's got a slightly different dialect there. And for the results for creaky voice, this is an example of what I looked at. So on the left you have F5, she's one of the older speakers from Rangoon, her production of the word for climb, ta. You see this very clear creaky voice, those glottal pulses, those nice arrowheads there, versus F4's complete modal voicing. There's not a creak in there. So ta, without the creakiness. So this younger speaker is not producing this traditionally checked lexical item with the creaky voice that we might expect. And so overall, I noticed this as I was recording and analyzing, so I went through and I counted up for each of the lexical items that were described as having traditionally checked tones. Did they produce the creaky voice or did they not? And overall, by speaker, this is the breakdown. So F1, always, she was actually very adamant about it. She always had the creaky voice when you would expect her to for tones 2, 4, and 5. 2, 4, 5. But the younger speakers, F2, F3, F4, and M1, not so much. They only produced it some of the time. F5 is another adult speaker. She did produce it more than the millennials, but more than half the time, but much less than F1. And I'm attributing that to the fact that they do speak different dialects, and I have other phonetic markers that show that they speak different dialects that I don't have time to go into today, but just trust me, I can send you that talk if you want. So I was wondering, okay, what if we break it down by tone? Are some tones more prone to being produced creaky or not? So for tone 2, again, you see the millennials kind of patterning after F5 as opposed to F1. F1 is always going to produce the creaky voice, but the millennials didn't really like to do it with tone 2 specifically. This is the tone they did it the least with. Which is funny because F1 through F3 are all from the same, they were all the same refugee camp. They all Mela. So They live together in the camp, but they have very different creaky patterns. Tone 5, or so tone 4, a little more uniform in terms of F2 through F5. M1 didn't like to creak so much for this one, but again we see more than half the time, but not quite always. So the millennials seem to be patterning more with F5 here. Now tone 5 is where things get interesting, because both of the older speakers always produce creaky voice here. Always. The millennials, not so much. So what's happening here? Well, my theory is that you've got all these different people from different places in Burma in these refugee camps speaking different dialects, and some of them consistently produce creaky voice like F1 and some of them don't. So the millennial speakers take this in, do some kind of leveling, and they sort of over-apply the variation in the creaky voice. So even though adult speakers will never produce a tone 5 lexical item without creaky voice, the millennials sometimes do because they're over-applying the rule. Okay. Language vitality, real quick, doesn't look good. They're not really learning it, and I'm going to give surveys to prove it. So yeah, it is time for questions though. So yeah. It's time for questions, please. Yeah.
Is there anything you can do to prevent the language from totally going away in the United States?
Yeah, I think honestly that there's hope, because at least, granted I can't speak for other communities in the US, but in North Carolina, in Orange County, there is a really big, very tight-knit Karen community. And they are very into preserving their language. I actually have some quotes from one of the participants. And the youth have all these Karen clubs in the high school. There's a community farm run by Karen refugees that the youth also participate in. So the youth are active in the Karen community. I think it's just in terms of the language resources are not there. And so if we can fix that, I think we can sort of slow down the death, if not completely prevent it. Because there is a Karen language class that kids go to at night that's actually taught by speaker F1. But she's only able to teach until the high school level, and then once they get to high school, they can't take it anymore. And I've heard some of them express interest in taking it. So right now there's just not resources. So we're talking about the linguistic landscape. There's no current texting. There's no current anything. There's hardly any current books. So if we can fix that, I think we can help change it. But, yeah. There's hope. Yeah.
Well, and I was thinking about going that same way to the extent that you can use technology to access, I don't know what the internet policy is in Burma, if there's open access, if people can Skype and that sort of thing. I know that there have been situations like that where people are trying to maintain first speaker or native language speed of contact with the millennial generation.
Yeah, I know. I've heard a lot of my consultants say that they Skype with people back home. I'm not sure what the situation is in the refugee camps, though. So the refugee camps might be a much different situation, but I think at least the people who still have people back in Burma, especially in places like Yangon, they do Skype regularly.
And don't forget, libraries often have, if they didn't have access to the local libraries, they all have computers there, and that's often the case for access.
Yeah, definitely.
Do the millennials typically write it in the traditional script for whatever it's used for Scott Karen, or do they typically use the Latin alphabet?
When they write down in Karen, they always the Karen alphabet.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because there isn't a standard way to write Scott Karen in Latinate script. That's actually one of our pet projects, so we can give EMTs pamphlets and stuff. This is how you say stuff in Scott Karen. But it's a modified version of the Burmese script, and every time I've ever seen anybody write in Scott Karen, it's always in that script. So.
Thank you. The question that I have is that, so the topic is scripted on the name, and that F1.
Yes.
Speaker. I was just wondering whether you could compare her to other speakers of her generation, and actually compare overdoing.
Overdoing, yeah.
Highlight the distinctiveness.
Yeah. Yeah, she might honestly be pretty similar with version that she thinks is like the most proper. She does have some other points of dialect variation that slip through with her, but I do have data from other speakers in her generation from different places in Burma that I have yet to analyze, that I am going to look at. I do have F5, who's about the same age, and it's a very different dialect group. The problem with this study was one of the requirements was they had to be at least conversational in English, and that does tend to be the millennial crowd as opposed to the older speakers. But I do have several older speakers that I have yet to analyze, so it'll be interesting to see whether that tone 5 especially is always creaky. It seems to be so far. Yeah.
Don't falling tones in a lot of tonal languages end up creaky? Isn't
Yeah.
that like a common feature of
Yeah.
falling tones?
Yeah, especially these tones originally historically had a glottal stop at the very end. So that's sort of one theory that's out there is these became falling tones going into the glottal stop, and then eventually it just spread.
Have you contrasted or looked at the amount of creaky voice you get in languages like Thai or Mandarin with what the millennials are doing with falling tones?
I haven't looked at those yet, but that would be
I don't know if that would be
yeah.
interesting or not. I mean, but to me it would be interesting if they're doing, if it sort of maps out to be almost the same as
Yeah.
non-phonemic creaky voice that gets into languages like that. that
Yes,
don't have-
especially since these camps are in Thailand. Now, granted, they don't have a lot of contact with the Thai people, but yeah, that would be interesting to see. I'll take that one. Okay, thank you. Sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, thank you very much for the talk. It was really good. You mentioned the language death, or maybe whether we could prevent it. Isn't the lack of creaky voice already the first step towards language death, since it's different to what the real speakers speak?
Yeah, that's something I sort of need to tease out more, especially with the analysis of more non-millennial speakers, some of the older generation. I need to see how much variation there is in creaky voice production among that generation, maybe compare it to the millennials. So far, it seems like they're just overgeneralizing for the one tone, for the tone 5. But I'm not really sure whether it's them coming. I don't think it's them coming here that's changed it necessarily, because most of them spent most of their formative years in Thailand. So I think it's probably more to do with contact between different Karen dialects, but I have to still do that.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We actually have a break scheduled in now, so we will